Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Dark Castle, a platforming title developed by Silicon Beach Software and released for the Macintosh computer platform in 1986, with a number of ports to other computer platforms and home consoles following in later years. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 123, and it is another special episode because this one is another Patreon-sponsored episode. This one is sponsored by Sean Marshall. Sean did send in a message for all of us to listen to about why Dark Castle means something to him. So Sean, take it away.
Thank you, Tony, for providing me with the opportunity to discuss Dark Castle, my very first computer game, and for that matter, my very first video game ever. Picture it. The year is 1987 in Ventura, California. I come home from school and my dad has revealed to all of us, we have a computer. A Macintosh SE with its 9-inch grayscale screen in all its glory, to be exact. I had no idea what it was, but if you've ever seen Zoolander and the files are in the computer scene, you know what I'm talking about. It wasn't exactly like that, but it was certainly a foreign concept to our family. So my room was across the hall from the spare bedroom that was turned into the computer room, and that is when my gaming days started. Well, technically gaming nights, as I would sneak out of my room in the middle of the night, flip on the switch to hear that old faithful Macintosh startup sound. Well, this game wasn't the only one on the computer. It also had Load Runner, but Dark Castle to me was the better of the two games. And while I have not played this game since those days, I will also look back fondly as it being my very first video game. And like many of you here listening today, led me down the path of being a video game nerd for the remainder of my life. Again, thank you, Tony, and the CGT community. I hope you enjoy the episode.
Thank you, Sean, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. If you would like to sponsor an episode or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout-out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo review kind of section. And I say pseudo review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics, how does the game look, the sound and music, how does the game sound, the narrative and or story, if the game has one, playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go. But I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Dark Castle. Dark Castle is a platforming title developed by Silicon Beach Software and released for the Macintosh computer platform in 1986, with a bunch of ports to other computer systems and home consoles following in later years. Before we can talk about Dark Castle, we've got to dive a bit further back into history to discuss the Macintosh computer platform and the state of the personal computer market in the late 70s through the mid-80s. Because Dark Castle represents an incredibly important release in computer and video game history. And unlike today's desktop computer market, which is almost universally focused on the Windows platform as it relates to gaming, back in the earlier days of the computer industry, the landscape was decidedly different. We have spoken before about the birth of the personal computer market, where the earliest machines that made their way into people's homes were designed to enhance an individual's productivity, as opposed to being focused on entertainment, or even more specifically, gaming. Back when computers first started to become more prevalent in the home, the majority of those devices were intended to be used to help people balance their checkbooks, or maintain their Rolodex, or type up a letter, or potentially to organize their calendars, a set of digital equivalents to previously physical-only interactions. And over time, various computer software would continue to be developed to expand the productivity-based capabilities available to end users. Sure, there were also computer games being created around this time, but those titles, in comparison to more traditional productivity-based software, represented a significantly smaller slice of the overall personal computer software market. The curious amongst you might be wondering why that might be, and here the answer lies squarely on the general capabilities that most computer hardware was designed to deliver to end users. Unlike arcades and home consoles of the time, early computer hardware didn't have much in the way of graphical interfaces or advanced sound capabilities, which meant that any software that was going to run on those computers would most likely need to utilize text-driven interfaces, which is why any games that did exist around this time were primarily text-based adventures, like Will Crowther's Colossal Cave Adventure, because text was something computers were actually good at both displaying and processing. And because of that text-heavy focus, computers became a natural fit for productivity-driven software packages, because you don't need a ton of graphical bells and whistles to type a letter or add an address to your contact book. You need a screen, and you need some keyboard-entered text, and that's pretty much it. These computers might not have had the prettiest interfaces, and they may not have been the easiest to use for less tech-savvy users, but for those individuals jumping into the early days of the personal computer market, this was an accepted fact of life. In that early computer market, several different companies were vying for consumers' attention, with two of the big hitters of the time being IBM, who would eventually institutionalize the IBM-compatible PC standard, and Apple, who even back in their earlier days did things just a little bit different than their competitors. Like I mentioned, the majority of computers in the late 70s and early 80s were purely text-centric, with any degree of graphical capability requiring extensive workarounds to implement, or the use of character-based text to mimic the appearance of graphical objects on the screen. Apple, however, had a different approach, and when they decided to release their first Apple II system in 1977, they knew that they wanted to do something to distinguish themselves from their competition, which is why they designed the Apple II to support high-resolution, for the time, full-color graphics as a native capability of the platform. And over the next few years, multiple models of the Apple II would be created and released on the market, most of which had increased graphical and processing capabilities over their predecessors, and certainly had more advanced graphics than the majority of their competition. What this meant is that if you wanted to use a mainstream personal computer with actual graphical capabilities, you were likely going to need to get an Apple II. And by extension, if you were a software developer around this time with the desire to create graphics-based computer games, you were almost certainly going to need to target the Apple II as your computer platform of choice. That's why, when Online Systems co-founders Roberta and Ken Williams wanted to create the first graphical adventure game, they chose the Apple II. It was the only mainstream computer platform capable of doing the things they wanted to do. And a number of other developers would end up following suit over the years following the Apple II's release. Despite the more advanced capabilities that the Apple II ecosystem provided, actually using that computer, or really any other computer from around the same time, was not a straightforward user-friendly experience. Because of that, various computer consultation companies would end up being founded in the early 80s, the intent being to provide dedicated training and hands-on support for early users of these somewhat monolithic productivity-focused machines. And those users, by the way, were fairly fanatical about their desire to use their newly bought computers in any number of new and interesting ways. Think about it from their perspective. You've just spent a ton of money on a brand new device called a personal computer. You'd certainly want to do whatever you could to make that investment meaningful, which in the early days of the computer market meant buying whatever software might have been available and trying it out, in the hopes that it would, in some way, make your life easier or better. Even though those early adopters wanted to get meaningful value out of their new investment, they sometimes needed some help to really understand how best to use their machines and the related software they had bought, which was the impetus behind entrepreneur Charlie Jackson's desire to form his own computer training business in the early 80s. Jackson saw the potential in computers, and he himself became one of the earlier adopters of personal computer technology, having bought and worked on computers from a variety of different manufacturers from the late 70s through the early 80s, most prominently the IBM PC and the Apple II, which were the two leading standards of the time. He recognized that these machines could potentially change the world for the better, if only they weren't so darn difficult to use. Still, that general lack of user-friendliness would end up making Jackson some money, as his company provided hands-on training for users attempting to install and use software on these machines. And even though the general usability of computers in the mid-80s was dramatically improved from their earlier iterations, things still weren't at the point where using a computer was an entirely intuitive experience. That would all start to change in 1984, which is when Apple unveiled their Macintosh computer system to the world. The Macintosh was unlike nearly every other computer that had been released up to that point, with a fully graphical, mouse-driven user interface, advanced sound capabilities, the ability to visually navigate the files and folders on your computer, and a much more user-friendly experience supported by software that, unlike the text-based applications of the past, were actually able to be understood by a layperson without significant technical know-how. The Macintosh was designed so that anyone could sit down and begin using it without needing to read esoteric computer manuals or call a computer expert to hold their hand. The Macintosh was a computer for everyone, and once it hit the store shelves, the personal computer market would be changed forever. In much the same way as Charlie Jackson was an early adopter of computer systems like the IBM PC and the Apple II, he saw the Macintosh as something with an insane amount of potential, especially considering how much more user-friendly and graphical the Macintosh was in comparison to other computers of the time. While Jackson had up to this point made a living with his computer training and consultation business, the release of the Macintosh provided a different opportunity that Jackson had hoped to capitalize on. Rather than simply providing training services to future Macintosh users, what if he could instead get into the software development business? The Macintosh was a brand new computer platform, and if Jackson could figure out how to release some software for it before other companies made their mark, he figured he'd have a real shot at becoming a major player in the computer industry. There was just one problem. Jackson knew business, and he knew that pivoting to software development for a popular new computer platform was likely going to be more lucrative than continuing to provide training for computer users. But Jackson was not a software developer, and in fact didn't have the slightest idea as to how to program anything on a computer, let alone a system that had just been released on the market. He knew that he needed to find some help if he was going to turn this software development opportunity into a reality. The only question was, where would Jackson find a couple software developers to join him on this new business venture? Interestingly, Jackson himself would provide the answer to that question, as shortly after the Macintosh became available to buy, he would start up the first San Diego Macintosh user group, with the hope that he would be able to find some passionate programmers who would be interested in trying to develop new software for the Macintosh. Luckily for Jackson, that first user group session would bear fruit almost immediately, as it was that session that would eventually lead to both Jonathan Gay and Eric Zoker, two young, albeit experienced, programmers being recruited by Jackson to work with him in developing software for the Macintosh. Jonathan Gay was a high school student who had recently won a science fair competition as a result of his work developing a graphics editing program for the Apple II, and despite his expertise with the Apple II, the thought of working on a brand new computer platform appealed to him. And similarly, Eric Zoker was a student at the University of California, San Diego, where he had been attending school for computer science, and he was intensely interested in putting his formal education to the test, with the release of Macintosh becoming the gentle nudge he needed to jump into the personal computer software business. Both Gay and Zoker, after a couple of brief discussions with Jackson, were fully sold on the idea of developing Macintosh software, and in fact, were both incredibly excited about the opportunity to get in on the ground floor of a new computer platform. With Jackson providing the business background and funding, and Gay and Zoker both bringing their technical expertise to the table, the company Silicon Beach Software was officially formed in mid-1984. When Silicon Beach Software was originally formed, it wasn't entirely clear what the company's first product would end up being, with Jackson considering a number of different options. The company could potentially enter the productivity software space, a part of the computer industry that Jackson knew was fairly popular, given his prior experience supporting the Apple II and IBM PC platforms. Alternatively, Jackson considered that they might be able to enter the still developing computer game market, and with the Macintosh providing more advanced graphics and sound than other computing platforms, he thought that this might be a niche that the newfound company could really make their mark on. Jackson briefly deliberated over this decision, until eventually he came to the conclusion that making a game would be the best way for Silicon Beach Software to enter the Macintosh software market. With that decision finalized, work on the title that would eventually come to be known as Airborne officially got underway. Designing Airborne would fall to Jackson himself, who had a concept for a game involving the player being in control of an anti-aircraft gun and a mortar, both of which could be used to attack incoming aircraft, parachutists, and other enemy vehicles, with the Macintosh mouse being used to aim and fire the weaponry at those opposing enemy forces, reminiscent in some ways to the classic arcade title Missile Command, but still unique enough to be a completely standalone, independent experience. Jackson would send various design ideas to Jonathan Gay, who would spend his weekends coding these different concepts into an actual playable game using a different Apple computer, the Apple Lisa, which was effectively the much more expensive, developer-centric version of the Apple Macintosh, while Eric Zoker, Silicon Beach Software's other employee, would be responsible for adding sound to the game, a move that Jackson hoped would be able to utilize the advanced sound capabilities of the Macintosh to create an auditory experience that would engage and impress prospective players. There was just one issue. Since the Macintosh was so new, there wasn't yet a broad understanding of just how extensive those audio capabilities would be. As Zoker began looking through various Macintosh documentation, he discovered that the computer had a 4-channel synthesizer that could be used to play various synthesized sounds, which was interesting, but not really all that exciting, or dramatically different than other computer platforms of the time. More interesting, however, was the fact that the Macintosh could play back pre-recorded digital audio files, assuming you could figure out how to record and encode an audio file using the minimal amount of storage that was available on floppy disks of the time. This concept of playing pre-recorded audio on a computer was an entirely new thing, and something that hadn't even been possible up to this point, short of prototype devices not yet widely available to consumers, and Zoker quickly became excited at the prospects of including real audio with Silicon Beach Software's forthcoming game. There was just one challenge left to overcome. Zoker didn't know how the heck he would actually be able to get recorded audio into the Macintosh in the first place, because it wasn't like a microphone could simply be attached to the computer, and nobody, literally nobody, had ever attempted to do something like this before. As luck would have it, Jackson had some connections at the University of California that had a lab capable of encoding pre-recorded audio into digital files, and further had the right equipment to transfer those digital files onto a Macintosh computer, which, by the way, was not a simple process. And then, once those files actually made their way onto a Macintosh, Zoker had to figure out how to actually play the sounds, which required a custom sound player program to be written that would hopefully be able to utilize the embedded Macintosh audio driver to play back the encoded sound file. After going through that whole process, Zoker found the file, loaded up his program, and hit play. And to the delight of everyone, the Macintosh played that audio back through its built-in speakers, a moment in computing history that was incredibly important, albeit not really all that well known outside of mid-80s Macintosh gaming aficionados. Once Zoker figured out how to play sounds back on the Macintosh, the next step was actually embedding those sounds into the game the company was working on, Airborne, and here Zoker faced yet another obstacle. Gabe was able to code the game to play back the sounds Zoker had recorded, but on a periodic basis as those sounds were being played, the Macintosh speaker would emit a popping sound, which was irritating and frequent enough that it would be a real distraction for anyone attempting to play the game. Luckily, Zoker discovered a solution that, honestly, is ridiculously technical, though still super interesting, as it involves calculating the timing of when the Macintosh sound buffer would become full, and then syncing the flush and refresh of that buffer with the refresh rate of the computer graphics subsystem, which, when done properly, was able to eliminate the popping noise and instead result in flawless, albeit low fidelity, digital audio playback. When the team fired up the game for the first time and was met with real audio playing from their newly created computer game, there was wide recognition that this was something truly special. And as soon as the company began demonstrating the game at various industry events, others in attendance thought the same exact thing. The ability to have high quality, for the time, pre-recorded audio tied to a gaming experience was unlike anything that gamers had seen before, short of Laserdisc-based arcade titles like Dragon's Lair, whose entire game was effectively a pre-recorded series of video sequences. Airborne effectively was the first time such high-quality audio was playable in an at-home game, and the audio work was so well done that even Apple's own Macintosh team asked Silicon Beach Software how they got their game to play back digital audio in such a refined way. That's right. Apple's own engineers didn't think something like this was possible, which is absolutely crazy to think about. Those early game demonstrations would eventually pave the way for a full-scale release, and Airborne would become available on the market as an Apple Macintosh exclusive in 1985. Upon its release, Airborne would end up selling relatively well, with critics and players alike both being impressed by the quality of the game's design, as well as the insane audio capabilities of the title. Airborne's success, much like Charlie Jackson had hoped, was strong enough to make Silicon Beach Software a well-respected, if still new, software development company, and Jackson and the rest of the team would use the proceeds from Airborne sales to hire more employees, expand into the software publishing space, and also begin to develop productivity software, where the company would focus their efforts on creating several high-quality graphics and photo editing applications that would end up being incredibly influential to future graphics designers, and would further serve to allow Silicon Beach Software to be recognized as a well-respected Macintosh software development studio. Despite the company's expansion, however, there was still a desire to continue developing games for the Macintosh. And, considering how revolutionary Airborne ended up being, Jackson and the rest of the team felt very strongly about trying to build upon that success for future titles. The only issue with Airborne from Jackson's perspective is that he himself had designed the game, and he was not, by his own admission, a game designer. Like we talked about previously, Jackson was a businessman and an entrepreneur. The fact that he was able to design a well-respected title like Airborne ended up becoming was partly latent skill, but was also, to a degree, luck. Jackson didn't want to leave Silicon Beach Software's next game up to chance. He wanted to put the appropriate measures in place to make their next game an even greater success than Airborne had been, which meant he had to find and hire a real game designer. As luck would have it, right around the same time as Silicon Beach Software was in the market for a designer, computer graphics and art prodigy Mark Steven Pierce was searching for a new job. From a very early age, Pierce had been interested in art and graphics design, and his level of expertise was so advanced that he was able to begin attending the School of the Art Institute of Chicago at the age of 14. While attending college, once again as a 14-year-old, Pierce began to explore using computers to both generate and animate digital graphics, an area of interest that would continue to deepen until eventually, after graduating from college, Pierce would end up being the co-founder of a new company called Macromind, with the intent of creating commercial software for the newly released Apple Macintosh computer platform. That company, Macromind, had two main areas of focus. One was music and audio production, which would see the release of a tool called MusicWorks in 1985, while the other focus area, which most closely aligned with Pierce's own interests, was video and animation, with a dedicated animation software program, VideoWorks, being released in 1986. Pierce absolutely loved working with VideoWorks, and given his prior experience and inherent expertise, he ended up becoming one of the primary individuals responsible for developing demonstrations and examples of what that toolset was capable of, with Pierce's work being so good that it became the basis for many of VideoWorks' promotional materials that would be used to help market the application. Despite Pierce's love of the tool, however, he would end up leaving Macromind in 1986, in a move that would turn out to be a blessing in disguise. Because, shortly after leaving Macromind, Charlie Jackson's company, Silicon Beach Software, would notice Pierce's work and decide that he was the missing piece needed to bring their new, still undefined game to life. A quick discussion and a short flight later, and Mark Steven Pierce was Silicon Beach Software's newest employee. As Pierce joined the company, he met with the other members of the team to review the current design concepts behind their to-be-created game, which was pitched as a platforming title that would involve the player character using modern weaponry and progressing through a series of levels, each of which would be distinct and unique from one another, with no real unifying design concepts or graphical elements shared between the levels. In short, the concept at this point was just a collection of random levels, not really a cohesive game. But in all fairness, this was still early on in the development process, and the team was anxious to hear Pierce's feedback to hopefully refine that concept into a more integrated framework. Pierce, however, was not impressed, and basically told the team that their idea sucked, before telling them exactly what they were going to do instead. A bold move, especially for a new employee, and one that could have potentially backfired. The only thing that ended up saving Pierce from a potentially short-sighted career move, though, was the fact that he ended up laying out a design for a game that the entire team agreed was light years better than their original concept. Over the course of the next few hours, Pierce drew up a series of storyboards for a brand new game concept involving a player character exploring a deadly castle, complete with traps to avoid, creatures to fight, and secrets to uncover, all with the goal of defeating the ruler of the castle, an evil Black Knight, with the assistance of a couple magical items that players would pick up at various points throughout their adventure. At the end of that marathon brainstorming session, the team was exhausted, but also enthused by the fact that they now had a fully fleshed out game design that everyone believed could be turned into an amazing game, a title that would eventually become known as Dark Castle. Work on Dark Castle began immediately following that design discussion, with Pierce working to pull together more detailed design concepts and artwork for the game, while Jonathan Gay would receive those designs and convert them into game-usable assets and mechanics, integrating them into a series of increasingly complex prototypes that Pierce would then end up playing to provide feedback on. This iterative process would continue over a period of 4 months, during which Gay and Pierce would literally mail floppy disks full of ideas, art, and executable files to one another, because remember, this was 1986, a period of time before a pervasive internet, and electronic mail and digital file transfers were not yet commonplace, even within high-tech companies and software development studios. This work would eventually pay off though, as Dark Castle was shaping up to be an incredibly impressive title, a sort of black and white interactive cartoon, where players could traverse the titular castle and hopefully become immersed in the smoothly animated, highly detailed scenes that made up each and every screen of the game, with some even taking inspiration from classic arcade titles that Pierce and the rest of the team had held in high regard. Dark Castle, from a visual and gameplay perspective, looked like it was going to be a hit. The question at this point was, would Dark Castle also sound like a hit? Like we talked about, the team at Silicon Beach Software had figured out a way to use the Macintosh's built-in digital audio capabilities to great effect during the creation of Airborne, with true pre-recorded audio clips being included with the game. A dramatic improvement over the traditional beeps and boops that accompanied most computer titles from around the same time, not to mention those that were entirely silent. As work on Dark Castle continued to progress, the team knew that they wanted to make sure to use those same digital audio capabilities in their forthcoming game. Though here, they didn't want to use digital audio just as a whiz-bang technical feature. They wanted to use digital audio to make the world of Dark Castle come to life, as their goal with the game was to create a sort of interactive cartoon, and there was wide recognition that in order to achieve that vision, they needed some really high-quality audio design. So the team proceeded to record various sound effects for eventual inclusion in the game, and even enlisted the help of a man named Dick Noel, a retired voiceover artist who had been working as a tester with the company, to record various vocal characterizations that would be included in the final game. These vocal characterizations were intended to impart a sense of cartoon-like whimsy to the experience, and while none of them would really be what I'd classify as recorded dialogue, the vocal-based sounds would end up becoming an important part of the overall auditory environment for the game. And while I'll relay my own opinion on their inclusion a little bit later, suffice it to say that the team's goal was to, once again, create an audio experience unlike most other games on the market. The only question was, would their efforts help improve overall sales of the title? The answer to that question would come in 1986, which is when Dark Castle would officially release on the Macintosh computer platform. Upon its release, Dark Castle would be met with universal critical acclaim, with many critics declaring the game to be one of the best arcade games to ever be created for a personal computer platform, with some advertisements claiming that, for the first time, gamers were able to get an arcade-quality experience on their Macintosh computer. Beyond the marketing aspect of that claim, the fact is that many critics and players truly did feel like Dark Castle embodied the aspects of a high-quality arcade experience, despite the fact that it ran on a Macintosh and not a gigantic arcade cabinet. Dark Castle would end up selling thousands of copies for months following its release, and would remain at the top of Macintosh sales charts for over 39 months after its initial release date, not dropping out of the top 5 sellers for the platform until early 1990. And that staying power would end up extending beyond sales figures alone, as Dark Castle would be recognized by many to be one of the best games of all time, regardless of computer or video game platform. It was unquestionably a huge success for Silicon Beach Software. It was so successful, in fact, that Dark Castle would be ported to a ton of different platforms following its Macintosh release, including the MS-DOS, Commodore 64, and Amiga computer ecosystems, and the Sega Genesis and Philips CDI home consoles, just to name a few. The unfortunate thing is, each of those ports would end up being subpar in comparison to the original, with some suffering from the lack of mouse support for aiming, which made controls dramatically worse than the Macintosh version of the title, while others would have lower resolution, albeit color, graphics, a trade-off that not everyone looked at as a net gain. The fact is, despite Dark Castle being ported to numerous platforms over the years, the original remains, in the eyes of many, to be the definitive version of the title. Silicon Beach Software would follow that original up with a direct sequel entitled Beyond Dark Castle in 1987, once again designed for the Macintosh computer platform. Beyond Dark Castle would expand upon the original in nearly every way, with a much larger world to explore, more enemies to defeat, and interestingly, more nefarious ways to die. Much like the original Dark Castle, Beyond Dark Castle would be critically acclaimed and beloved by countless players, and many individuals from around that time wondered what would be next for this seemingly expanding game series. Unfortunately, following Beyond Dark Castle's release, Silicon Beach Software would decide to stop developing games entirely, instead choosing to focus on developing utilities and software packages, like a fairly popular line of image editing and art tools that were quickly becoming standards across the Macintosh user base. Interestingly, none of those utilities would end up selling nearly as well as Dark Castle and its sequel. But They also sold for significantly higher prices than the games Silicon Beach Software had developed, which at the end of the day meant that they actually made the company more money than their entertainment-focused titles. And it would be these utilities and software packages that would eventually lead to Aldus Corporation purchasing Silicon Beach Software in 1990, with Aldus Corporation eventually being acquired itself by Adobe Systems in 1994. Despite those acquisitions, Silicon Beach Software's legacy would remain, and future Adobe products like Adobe Home Publisher would be evolved forms of utilities that were originally created by Silicon Beach Software years prior. Even though Silicon Beach Software ceased to exist as a company as of 1990, its influence across the industry would continue to be felt for years to come. And nowhere is that influence felt more strongly than in Dark Castle's legacy, as even today, it continues to be recognized as one of the best games of all time, and a true landmark release in computer gaming. While various efforts to resurrect Dark Castle in recent years have seemingly stalled, that in no way diminishes the importance of its original release. Dark Castle remains a true Mac gaming classic, and as such is undeniably a title that will continue to be remembered and respected for countless years to come. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Dark Castle today versus when it was released almost 40 years ago. Dark Castle is effectively a platforming title with some very light action elements sprinkled in for good measure, and is very much a function of the time in which it was created. In fact, as I played through the game, it became fairly obvious that Dark Castle was inspired by several classic arcade titles in much of its platforming design, while at the same time adding in its own unique mechanics and flair that all combine together to make an experience that is truly unique for this era of gaming, especially if we're talking about Apple Macintosh gaming. First though, I should mention that for this particular episode, I played the original black and white version of Dark Castle, as designed for the Apple Macintosh. My understanding is that other versions and ports of the games, like the much-hated Sega Genesis version, are all subpar experiences, and beyond that, you all know I like experiencing the original release of games whenever possible, to truly understand what the game's developers intended the experience to be. So, all of our discussion is going to be focused on that original version. If you're trying to play a port or some other variation of the game, it's possible my commentary won't apply, so please keep that in mind. One other thing to keep in mind is that on Windows computers, you do not want to play Dark Castle in a browser window, like say if you were trying to play the game on archive.org. For some reason, this introduces significant lag to the controls, so much so that it becomes pretty much unplayable. If you're going to play Dark Castle, definitely get a local copy and run it on a dedicated Mac emulator, like Mini VMac, which is what I used for the game. Beyond being incredibly useful for early Mac gaming, Mini VMac emulates the entire Mac computer environment, so you have a true glimpse into this era of Mac computing, which for someone like me, was a blast to mess around with. Now that that's all out of the way, let's talk about Dark Castle. When you first start the game, one of the first things you'll notice is a set of difficulties that you can choose between: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. By default, the game is set to beginner difficulty, and if you're like me, you might immediately think to yourself, there is no way I'm going to play a game on beginner difficulty. Only here, that thought process will be met with the equivalent of a brick to the face if you try to pick any difficulty beyond beginner, at least when you first start playing the game. Because, as we'll discuss, this game is a strangely difficult experience, complete with interesting design decisions that make it amazingly unapproachable from a first-time player standpoint. I had never played Dark Castle before sitting down to play it for this episode, so I didn't really know what to expect. I knew of the game and I recognized its historical significance, but I had no expectations one way or the other when I booted the game up and began playing. Well, let me tell you, if you're not prepared for a hardcore, old-school, challenging experience, you may want to take a minute to compose yourself before you enter the game world. I mention all of this to say that the beginner difficulty here is actually the baseline game experience, with all subsequent difficulties really designed for people who want to challenge themselves, or as additional progression after you beat the game. Dark Castle works very similarly to arcade games of the time, where if you beat the game once, you'll be dropped back into the game for another run, this time on a higher difficulty setting. This continues infinitely, assuming you're good enough at the game, which means the only real milestone to mark an individual beating the game is to simply complete a single run, regardless of difficulty. If you want more of a challenge, play through it again and again. But otherwise, if you beat the game on its default beginner difficulty, that truly represents beating the game on the baseline challenge level the developers intended. Oh, and by the way, if you do start on beginner difficulty and beat the game, your next playthrough, assuming you continue, will carry over any consumable items you may have found, like elixirs and lives. All quest-based items will need to be collected again, but the fact that those consumables carry over is a big deal, because each jump in difficulty is truly no joke, especially at the beginning of each playthrough before you have some quest items that will make the game remarkably easier. Anyway, once you pick your difficulty and select play, you'll enter the titular Dark Castle, ready to do battle with the castle's minions in the hopes of eventually reaching the boss and defeating his evil reign. As you enter the game, you'll be placed in a hall of sorts with 4 different doors, corresponding to different passages into the castle. Doors 1 and 2 are somewhat randomized, in that they'll lead to either a set of dungeon levels with the in-game label of Trouble, or a series of levels that lead to a usable fireball, one of your quest items, which in-game is referred to as the fireball levels. Which door leads to which set of levels is randomized for each playthrough, and if your goal is to simply beat the game and not explore every section of the castle, the only one of those levels you need to visit is the fireball level set. The dungeon levels are unnecessary for game progression, though I can guarantee you're going to visit those levels numerous times for any playthrough, whether you want to or not. More on that design decision in a little bit. Other than doors 1 and 2, you also have door 3, which leads to the levels immediately preceding the Black Knight, who is the leader of the castle, and door 4, which leads to a set of levels that, assuming you complete them, will grant you a shield, which is another incredibly useful quest item. Technically, the game is entirely open-ended, in that you could go right for the Black Knight without gathering any other quest items, but if you do that, you will be at a serious disadvantage, so much so that I fail to see how anyone would be able to effectively beat the game short of having supernatural speedrunning abilities. Because there are certain enemies that can only be hit by the fireball, and there are certain sections that effectively require a pool of elixirs, lest you die from pesky rats that keep falling from the sky, and that's not even to mention the mugs of ale that the Black Knight throws at you, which without a shield would almost certainly spell an end to your run. Bottom line, don't go to the Black Knight unprepared. The ideal form of progression, as I've learned from hours of playtime, is to go for the shield first, followed by the fireball, followed by the Black Knight. And to illustrate why that is, let's talk about the various items in the game and what impact they have on gameplay. The shield, which should likely be the first stop on your adventure, will grant you a period of invulnerability when you use it, which you accomplish by pressing the Q key on your keyboard. This invulnerability mode lasts up to 4 seconds, as long as you keep holding the Q key down, after which it'll disable itself, forcing you to reactivate it. You can also pulse invulnerability for shorter periods of time if needed, and from my perspective, getting used to using your shield is probably one of the most important skills in the game, as it'll save you from untimely deaths time and time again. You do have to be careful that it doesn't run out unexpectedly, but after a few tests, you should get a pretty good feel for how the shield works and how long it lasts. After the shield, the only other quest item is the fireball, which turns the rocks you normally throw using your mouse into fireballs. These fireballs do more damage than your rocks, and can actually kill some enemies that are otherwise only able to be incapacitated, which is a huge benefit in many stages and can make navigating various levels a whole heck of a lot easier. So you might be asking yourself why I suggested getting the shield first as opposed to the fireball. Well, the reason for that is that you will face a couple of screens in the fireball section of the castle that will be made dramatically easier if you have the shield and its invincibility mode. I'm sure those screens can technically be completed without the shield, but based on my own experience, you don't really want to try that. It is really an exercise in frustration. So, let's say you collected the shield and the fireball, and you think, okay, time to take on the Black Knight. Well, let me dissuade you of that notion right away, because if you want to truly be successful, you'll need a little more backup. And here, backup refers to your pool of lives and elixirs, two depletable resources that you'll use a ton of as you attempt to defeat the Black Knight and traverse his castle. Elixirs can be picked up in various rooms as you explore the castle, which is another use for your Q key, which, by the way, is the default action key in the game. Want to pick something up? Q it. Want to take out your shield? Use Q. Want to pull a lever? Q is the way to go. This interaction and control scheme makes perfect sense, and actually feels surprisingly modern, but also comes with a bit of a design flaw that we'll talk about in a couple minutes. Anyway, elixirs appear randomly on the ground in various screens of the game, and you really want to prioritize picking them up whenever possible. Because elixirs are incredibly useful during your journey, as they allow you to not die from an errant rat or bat bite. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, big deal, how bad could a rat or bat bite be? To which I would say, in Dark Castle, 100% deadly, as the game operates on a one-hit, one-kill kind of model. No matter what you're hit with, if it makes contact with your body, you will die. And the way the different screens use rats and bats in different configurations will potentially cause you some difficulty in the early going. It's best to prioritize dealing with bats, as they will swoop down at you, albeit slowly, until they get in range to attack. Rats, meanwhile, will simply patrol whatever ledge or floor they're on, making them relatively easy to avoid. When taken in small quantities, the rats and bats are pretty easy to deal with by throwing your rocks or fireballs at them, which will kill them outright, though rats will respawn from a nearby hole in the wall. Bats, however, will not respawn, another good reason to target them first. When you have to deal with a significant number of rats and bats, though, you will most likely take some errant hits here and there, which is why elixirs are incredibly useful, and almost required in the lead up to the Black Knight, where you'll face one room where you need to traverse a series of dangling ropes as rats continuously spawn and descend those ropes, landing on platforms underneath you and making it so that one wrong jump or step would lead to instant death. A pool of elixirs allows you to make your way through that screen much easier, as you don't need to worry about colliding with a rat or two. You'll simply shrug off the hit without issue. The user interface for the game will show you up to 5 elixirs in your inventory, but the cool thing is that there are actually no limits to the number of elixirs you can carry. You won't know exactly how many elixirs you have beyond the 5 visible ones on the screen, but if you play the game with a focus on picking up elixirs wherever possible, you should have plenty of surplus elixirs to get you through to the final battle. Interestingly, each screen in the game resets itself every time you exit and re-enter the scene, which means you can technically farm elixirs and other items if you want. I didn't find this to be necessary because of the sheer number of times you'll likely make your way out of the dungeon, which we'll talk about shortly, but the option exists for those who want to use it. Beyond elixirs, you can also find bags of rocks on the ground, which will serve to replenish your only permanent weapon, a set of throwable stones. You can hold up to 89 rocks in your inventory at any point in time, which is a good thing, because you can burn through those rocks at a surprisingly fast clip, mostly because aiming your stone throws can be a bit hit or miss. Literally. And actually, before we talk about that, we should probably go over the general control mechanics for the game, which will help to illustrate why throwing rocks accurately will likely take some getting used to. Moving around each stage is accomplished using the incredibly modern control scheme of using W, A, S, and D to move up, left, down, and right respectively, while using items in the world or picking items up is accomplished using the Q key like we talked about, with the E key allowing you to duck as long as you hold the key down, and the spacebar allowing you to jump. Those jumps are actually modifiable depending on what other actions you might be taking at the time. If you're standing still, your jump will be a standard leap forward kind of move. If you're moving forward, then you'll take a running leap, which will cover more distance than the standard stationary leap. And pressing down with the S key while jumping will execute a much shorter leap, allowing you to cover less ground for more precise platforming. You'll end up using all of these jumps at various points throughout your adventure, and knowing when to use which based on the situation you're currently in will take some getting used to. I know when I first started playing the game, I had to play around with it a bit before I felt comfortable with some of the trickier platforming sections, simply because I needed to develop the skill to adequately judge how much distance I'd cover with each jump. I eventually got there, but it did take a little bit of time to be truly proficient. Outside of the keyboard, and in another incredibly modern touch, you'll also use your mouse to aim and throw rocks at enemies, which in theory sounds totally normal, but in practice can be easier said than done. The way it works is you move your mouse vertically to change the angle of your arm, and you click the mouse button in order to fling a rock at an enemy. Interestingly, while your arm only has several discrete visible positions, there are gradients of aim that allow you to fine-tune your throw, even if your arm doesn't visibly move. There were plenty of times when I saw a bat across the screen, aimed my throw, fired, and missed just slightly, requiring a minor adjustment either up or down, which then allowed me to hit my target. The continuous nature of aiming, despite only discrete angles being visible on the screen, is something I didn't realize existed when I first started playing, and I spent a little bit of time wondering just how I could aim properly if my arm angles were so restricted. It turns out the game simply doesn't show you all available throw angles as a visible shift in your arm's position, but it still allows you to fine-tune your aim as needed. And trust me, that level of finite aim adjustment will be needed, because some of the scenes you'll encounter in the game will require both sharpshooting and quick reactions depending on the enemies you're facing, which can include the previously mentioned flying bats and scaring rats, as well as armor-clad archers, mini-monsters, a gargoyle who will scream and whisk you away to the dungeon if he catches you, and several other special enemies that only appear in specific screens throughout the game. For the most part, your default rocks will work on all of those enemies, and most enemies are killable with a single hit. The armor-clad archers, though, will only be briefly incapacitated if you hit them with a stone, after which they'll get back up and start chasing you down again. If you hit the archers with your fireball, though, they will die, though in every screen that archers exist, there are off-screen doors that allow a new archer to take their place after a brief period of time. And actually, now that I think about it, I think the only enemy in the entire game that doesn't respawn are the bats. Everything else has some form of respawn mechanic, making it so that you're never truly safe, regardless of how effectively you've defeated your enemies. One enemy we haven't talked about yet though, except mentioning him briefly, is the gargoyle, which only spawns on the Black Knight set of levels, and can potentially ruin your day. Before spawning, the gargoyle will let out a couple of digitized screams, after which he'll swoop into the scene and make a beeline right for you. If you have the fireball and your aim is quick, you can potentially hit and kill him. If you don't have the fireball, or if your aim isn't quite up to par, then the gargoyle will grab you, fly partway across the screen, and drop you into a pit, which luckily won't deplete one of your lives, but will deposit you in a new section of the castle, the dungeon. The dungeon is an interesting location, because when you first encounter it, likely as a result of accidentally picking the wrong door at the beginning of your adventure, it will appear pretty darn challenging, and considering the only way out is to acquire a key, which is at the end of the dungeon, and then make your way all the way back to the beginning of the dungeon to unlock the door back to the hallway, it can definitely be a pretty harsh introduction to the game. I do not recommend you try the dungeon without your fireball and shield, which means I don't recommend you actively seek out the dungeon at all. Instead, let it come to you, either by the gargoyle dropping you into a pit, or you simply falling into a pit through your own misjudged jumps, because the dungeon is an area you will repeat, and repeat, and repeat many times as you attempt to make your way to the Black Knight. I can't tell you how many times I accidentally fell down a pit only to find myself back in the dungeon, needing to fight my way back out to the hall and then return to my prior location. When this first started happening, I believed this to be a silly design decision, one that was intended to artificially pad out the game and make it more challenging as a result. While I still believe that to be the case, I actually came to love my repeated trips to the dungeon, and that's because it let me stock up on a ton of elixirs and extra lives. Let me paint you a picture. You make your way to the Black Knight's room. You're working on how to conquer that bad guy, only to mistakenly miss a jump and fall through a pit in the floor. Crap, you think to yourself, I've got to fight my way through the dungeon, all the way back to the night, which honestly isn't that long, but stay with me here a sec. When this first happened to me, I was extremely irritated. But then I came to realize I can exploit my poor skill in avoiding pits to bolster my elixir pool as I make my way back to the knight, while also exploiting the fact that each screen you complete adds to your overall point total, with bonus points given for completing a screen as quickly as possible. And depending on your difficulty, reaching certain point thresholds will reward you with an extra life, with 5,000 points needed on the default difficulty and higher values needed for each subsequent difficulty setting. When you consider that you need to progress through 3 different dungeon screens and 2 different Black Knight screens before you can return to the boss fight, that means that you're almost guaranteed to get at least 1 extra life before you return to the boss, and maybe even 2. And because you don't lose a life if you fall into a pit and return to the dungeon, you can technically get into a situation where you continuously get extra lives as you fail each Black Knight encounter time and time again. Now, I recognize that my own poor skill is what led to this kind of extra life loop happening, but let me tell you, I got really good at escaping the dungeon and returning to the Black Knight, so much so that every time I fell down the pit, I looked at the situation as a safety net as opposed to a hindrance. This also allowed my point totals to balloon to heights that a skilled player would never see, with well over 200,000 points by the end of my playthrough, driven primarily by the fact that I had to repeat the dungeon so many times. In the end though, it was worth it, just to have the cushion of elixirs and lives that enabled me to not have to worry about making other silly mistakes during the Black Knight fight. Eventually, you'll become proficient enough at the game to make your way to the Black Knight without issue, defeat the evil boss of the castle, and save the day. If you do end up beating your playthrough, you're treated to a brief animation of you doing a victory dance, after which a gargoyle spawns, grabs you, and drops you down a pit back into the dungeon, where your next playthrough unceremoniously begins, with all of your quest items removed and your consumable items like elixirs, lives, and stones remaining intact. This next playthrough is set to the next highest difficulty level, which usually means more enemies, trickier enemy arrangements, and tighter timing on areas that have environmental hazards. For the truly brave, you can play the game again and again on repeat, similar to old school arcade experiences. For me though, one playthrough was enough to prove that I had conquered Dark Castle, and had finally become skilled enough to overcome the game's many challenges, both intended and otherwise. We'll talk more about some of the design decisions that serve to make Dark Castle an amazing experience, as well as some of the decisions that make it frustrating in just a minute. But first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at, where we didn't have a pervasive internet with gameplay videos and YouTube and all that kind of stuff. When we made a buying decision, oftentimes it was based on reviews we may have read in magazines, word of mouth from family and friends, and what the box looked like. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Dark Castle for the Macintosh computer platform, the back of the box says, Dark Castle. Can you defeat the Black Knight? The Black Knight is the evil ruler of the Dark Castle. Your task is to find him and defeat him in battle. But beware. First, you'll have to fight your way through chambers full of nasty hazards. Guards make their rounds, plague-infested rats and bats attack, the dragon breathes fire, the torturer wants to get his hands on you, and the wizard may or may not aid you with a spell. It could be a long day. Dark Castle is a fast-paced arcade-style action game in which you control the movements and actions of the hero as he battles his way through the castle. It features Silicon Beach's renowned real sound, which you have to hear to believe. The stunning graphics and smooth animation will take your breath away. There is so much to this game. It takes 2 discs to hold it all. It's frantic, it's hectic, it's hair-raising, but most of all, it's fun. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box that show different scenes from the game, and I've got to say, this one sells me in a very retro kind of way. Looking at the box now and looking at the graphics and the screenshots, I can affirmatively say that the game looks really good, even though it's black and white. The level of detail on the graphics in the back of the box looks amazing. And if I saw this on a store shelf back then, I would have thought, what kind of technical wizardry would get those level of quality or that level of quality in graphics in an actual computer game? It looked amazing. I also loved the fact that the back of the box actually touts the fact that the game is so big that it has to come on 2 discs, which I found strangely amusing, considering that that used to be one of the things when the CD-ROM based technologies and CD-ROM discs became prevalent in the 90s. That used to be something that game companies even then would tout as a major feature of the game. This game is so big that it comes on 4 CDs of action-packed goodness and full motion video sequences and whatever else. I find it interesting that even back in 1986, there was a form of bragging, might be too strong of a word, but as far as the marketing goes, claiming that the game was bigger because it came on multiple discs and having that be an actual selling point of the title, I found really interesting. Beyond that, though, I think the back of the box here definitely sells me on the game. It is certainly an old school gaming box, but I gotta tell you, I kind of love it. And I definitely want Dark Castle on my shelf at some point. I do not own this game outright. I'm looking at a listing on eBay right now, and it looks like for a boxed copy, looks like complete in box, it costs around $160. So that's a little steep for the game, for me, at least right now, because I don't have any particular nostalgia tied up with the game, but it is a game that I will eventually have on my shelf. Once I have the desire to spend that much money on what is effectively a collectible toy kind of thing, yeah, I'm going to have this on my shelf because I really do like the box. And actually, the front of the box looks even better. Like seeing the front of the box with the castle on it and the moonlit background and just the whole gothic, eerie feel of the box, this one sells me entirely. Moving on from back of the box, though, we're going to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Dark Castle, like we were just talking about, are, in a word, amazing, which you might be surprised about considering there are literally only 2 colors on the screen, black and white. This is the literal definition of 1-bit color, and for the uninitiated, you might think that the game would be lower in detail as a result. That, however, would be completely false, as Dark Castle's graphics are beautiful and show a design aesthetic that extends well beyond its limited 1-bit color palette. And using clever pixel arrangements and exploiting how collections of pixels look when placed next to each other, the game takes on a grayscale kind of appearance, with numerous shades of gray seemingly visible to the eye, while still only truly consisting of black and white pixels. This leads directly to the overall level of detail in the game's environments, which is, to put it bluntly, far more complex than what you would expect from a 1-bit title. In fact, every environment in the game is so detailed that the game looks dramatically more impressive than the majority of 8-bit titles from around the same time, with the black and white colors and overall artistic style creating a gothic, foreboding atmosphere that is simply a joy to look at. Dark Castle is proof that simply throwing technical capabilities at a game and having the most polygons, colors, and highest frame rate does not automatically make a game better looking than another. From my perspective, Dark Castle looks as good, if not better, than many full-color titles, and I never once looked at the game and thought, oh, this would be better with color. In fact, I think the game was actually better without color, because it truly evoked the feeling of playing an old-school game on an old-school computer, and I simply loved how the game looked. Compared to the environmental graphics, characters and enemies are just a bit lower fidelity, but still nicely detailed. The true star of the show when it comes to the character graphics, though, is the animation, which is all very smooth and feels, to a degree, cinematic, at least as cinematic as a mid-80s Macintosh computer was capable of being. Moving your character around the screen gave me definite Prince of Persia vibes, with smooth animations that play out for every action you take. Now, Prince of Persia's animations are dramatically smoother and more nuanced, but it's still a valid comparison for those who may have played Prince of Persia but haven't played Dark Castle. Overall, the game looks great, and despite being an almost 40-year-old title, still remains wonderful to look at, even today. Moving on to the sound and music, I'd like to relay a story here. As I began Dark Castle for the first time and the title screen appeared, I saw the titular castle as thunder cracked, lightning flashed, and Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor played its iconic opening bars, and my immediate thought was, what the heck is going on? This is a game from 1986, and the very first auditory introduction to the title is a fully digital version of Thunder and a famous piece of classical music, not a MIDI rendition. The legit, real version of the song. In a world where most games, software, and computers of the era were limited to rudimentary synthesis-based sounds, hearing the equivalent of a WAV file play when the game started up was shocking. And, like we talked about, it would have been even more shocking for players booting this up for the first time in the mid-80s. I never expected such clear digital audio in a title this old, yet here we are. Absolutely amazing first impression. Unfortunately, the brief 5-ish second opening to Toccata and Fugue in D minor is literally the only music in the entire game, which was a bit of a disappointment, but honestly, not all that shocking considering how much space digital audio files take up and the fact that Dark Castle was shipped on two 800 kilobyte floppy disks. It would have been a technological marvel for a game from the mid-80s to have a fully digital soundtrack, and I would have been flabbergasted if Dark Castle had digital audio background tracks as I played the game. In reality, there was no music beyond the opening title card, which is a shame, but ultimately didn't detract from my enjoyment of the game at all. In fact, the lack of music even helped to enhance the dread and gothic atmosphere, an unexpected side effect that I ended up appreciating. There were, however, a number of digital sound effects included in the game for various actions and monsters, and here the game once again used real recorded audio as opposed to synthesized sounds, which I've got to say added a degree of charm to the whole experience that is hard to convey via words. But I'm going to try anyway. You know how older games were filled with experimentation, primarily because nobody really knew what they were doing yet, and there were no standards, and developers simply tried to do quote-unquote stuff in the hopes that some of it would work? Well, that's kind of what the sounds in Dark Castle remind me of. There's nothing here that screams professional sound effects, but everything that is included is just so darn likable that it makes the whole experience better. Whether it's the weird noise some monsters make that almost sound like they're teasing you, to the fluttering of bat wings that most certainly were not recorded from real bats, or the utterings your character makes after getting stunned for a couple seconds. All of the sounds here are amazing, and I loved every single one of them. If you're looking for super professional, high-definition recordings that match the objects and creatures in the environment, you might personally have some critique at the facsimiles here, but I personally have no complaints. Moving on to the narrative and story, in Dark Castle, a number of towns and villages are being terrorized by a cruel person named the Black Knight, who has holed himself up in a castle where he sits on his throne all day, drinking mead and torturing prisoners. You play as Prince Duncan, a local noble who has finally had enough of the Black Knight's reign of terror, and you resolve to topple the knight's throne, literally and figuratively, to hopefully restore peace to the land. The story here is pretty much as basic and standard as it comes, which, given the fact that Dark Castle is an arcade platformer, and the fact that the game was released in 1986, is totally fine. In fact, I commend the fact that the game has any storyline at all, even if it never is referenced in the game itself via any sort of exposition, text, or cutscene. Dark Castle is from an era where narratives in gaming were not much of a thing, so as long as you know that before you begin playing, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise. Overall, there's not much here, and in this case, that's entirely acceptable. Moving on to the playability and controls, we've already talked about the general structure and framework for the game, including the controls you have at your disposal, so I'm not going to rehash that all here. What I do want to call attention to, though, is the fact that the controls for Dark Castle feel 100% modern, in that they are, in fact, a replica of modern control schemes that we find in nearly every game today, with WA, S, and D used for movement, Q for actions and item usage, E for ducking, and the spacebar for jumping, coupled with the mouse for aiming and throwing your stones. In fact, I'm incredibly surprised that Dark Castle in 1986 had all of this figured out, as we wouldn't see a return to this particular control scheme for years. The first-person shooter genre gets a lot of the credit for popularizing the WASD control scheme, but Dark Castle did it before any of them, and on a Mac, no less. That's crazy to think about. And when I sat down to begin playing the game, the control mechanics were one of the first things that struck me as being a pleasant surprise. As for the controls themselves, they all work pretty well for the most part, though I will say that momentum when moving around can sometimes take a little getting used to. There were several occasions where I took just one too many steps, forcing me over a ledge and eventually plummeting to the ground below. Depending on the height of that fall, I either became stunned for several seconds or died, losing a life in the process. And actually, we should probably talk about the whole stun mechanic, because you will get stunned as you play the game. From what I can tell, there are two situations that could potentially cause you to become stunned. Either you fall from a distance that's not a high enough height to kill you, but still multiple character lengths high, or you run into the side of the screen, which I suppose is considered the castle walls in the game, bouncing off and becoming stunned in the process. In both situations, being stunned with enemies around is not a good thing, because you will be stunned for several seconds, and there is literally nothing you can do to speed this up. When this happens, you better hope you're not near an enemy, because if you are, it's almost a certainty that you'll end up losing a life. Over time, you'll learn which falls will cause you to become stunned, and you'll get comfortable enough with the controls to avoid running into walls. So ultimately, you'll likely get stunned less and less the more you play the game. The stun mechanic itself is actually not a bad gameplay mechanic, despite how irritating it might be to get stunned as you're trying to get used to moving around the game world. Much more egregious is a gameplay mechanic involving slightly raised platforms, which honestly baffles me. The way it works is if you see a slightly raised platform and you attempt to run over it, you will fall to the ground as though you just tripped over your own 2 feet. It doesn't matter if the platform is literally 3 inches off the ground. If you try to run over it, you will fall to the ground and will be forced to stand back up, slowly, leaving yourself open to attack. The answer to that mechanic is to jump either up or down that platform to avoid the fall. Now, I know this might sound like a minor annoyance, but I cannot impress upon you how strange it feels to see the slightest lip of a platform cause you to stumble to the ground. The fact that I need to jump to traverse a distance that amounts to a curb on the street is so infuriatingly silly that every time I messed up and forgot to jump, I'd immediately curse under my breath at the situation. It's not like your character is portrayed as a bumbling fool otherwise. He's actually quite capable, and is able to leap from platforms, climb ropes, defeat henchmen, and swing across moving chains. He's a pretty athletic guy. Why a slight change in elevation causes him to trip to the ground as though you've had your leg swept in a one-sided karate tournament is ridiculous to me. From my perspective, a truly questionable design decision. Moving past that annoyance, there are a couple other critiques I want to mention before we move on. First, I know I mentioned it before, but it bears repeating. Aiming your rock throws can be pretty tricky in the early going. The only advice I can give if anyone ends up playing the game is to practice a bit, because you will get better at it. The second minor critique has to do with using the Q key as both the general action button as well as your shield use button, because depending on where you are in the environment, you may or may not trigger the action you actually want to accomplish. The issue lies in the fact that there are some sections of the game, primarily the final fight against the Black Knight, where the ground could have items, the platforms are narrow, and you also need to pull a series of levers and chains in order to be successful. At the same time, the knight is throwing empty tankards at you, which if you get hit, will kill you. Whether you're trying to avoid those tankards, pick up those items, or pull those chains, the answer is the same. Use Q. The issue is, if you're close to an item or a pulley, and you have a tankard flying at you, your natural instinct will be to press Q so that you can use your shield and become invincible until the tankard passes by. But because you're near an item or a lever, the game thinks you want to pick up or pull that item instead, which means you won't be invincible when the tankard hits you, which means you'll die. And because the game's animations are nicely detailed, albeit pre-canned, as soon as you enter into an action like picking up an item, you're going to be stuck there until the animation plays out. You can't interrupt the animation at all. So, what ends up happening is, you die, You mutter a curse word, and then you try it all over again, resolving to not make the same mistake, despite the fact that you've made the same mistake 5 times already. Over time, you'll figure out how to best deal with those situations, but I do think that there might have been an opportunity to have the shield use key and the object pickup or use key to be different. It would have made the game slightly less streamlined, but would have removed a bunch of frustration as a result. Generally speaking, most of the issues I had with the game stemmed from what I consider to be questionable design decisions, but that critique is based upon observing advancements in game design that have occurred over the last 40 years of game development, so I honestly can't hold those decisions against the game too much. The fact is, Dark Castle is a surprisingly modern take on platforming, and while it is definitely an older school experience, there was a significant amount of thought and care placed into the creation of the game, and it remains playable, albeit challenging, even today. As I played Dark Castle, I truly had mixed emotions. When I first started playing the game, I was irritated by some of the annoyances I already mentioned, so much so that I had a pretty negative perception of the game for the first couple hours I spent playing it. Then, however, everything started to click, and I began to become enamored with the game's quirky charm, including some of those questionable design decisions that we just talked about that previously had served as pure irritation. Eventually, I'd come to truly appreciate Dark Castle as a monumental achievement in early platform game design, and one that still feels pretty darn good to play, at least after you get used to the controls and the situations you'll face in the game. Ultimately, I enjoyed my time playing Dark Castle, and I am truly glad I was able to catch a glimpse of this era of Mac gaming, which is a personal blind spot of mine that I'm attempting to address. Dark Castle stands as one of the brightest stars from that time period and platform, and even today, maintains a fair amount of that shine. So what is our verdict on Dark Castle? Well, Dark Castle is a game that rewards patience, practice, and perseverance. If you come into the game looking for a quick fix platforming kind of experience, you'll likely be disappointed, as Dark Castle is not a particularly welcoming experience. Take the time to get to know it though, and you'll uncover a mostly well-designed game that can be really fun and rewarding to play, which is why, for me, Dark Castle is a solid addition to our list of golden oldies. In fact, I was this close to adding Dark Castle to our pantheon, but stopped just short due to some of the very old-school design decisions that I believed, for some, would be a major impediment to enjoying the game. Put in the time, though, and you may just find a new entry in your very own best classic games list. It may not be universally welcoming to new players, but Dark Castle remains an important release in gaming history, and is one that still shows its charms even today, which is why Dark Castle has just become the newest member on our list of golden oldies. That was our episode on Dark Castle. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on another classic Mac game. This one is Deja Vu, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on deja vu. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.